and welcome to the 11th episode of Text Appeal. It is quite easy for me to be enthusiastic about today's episode, likely because I absolutely love the topic of philosophy. I have been extremely busy with many projects, and this podcast always gives me something to come back to sort my ideas out. And I really wanted to put a lot of work into a thought-provoking episode that integrates my own creativity while still maintaining scientific integrity and intellectual humility. Today's episode will focus on something that you may be familiar with, but it is my intention to bring an old idea into a new light. Speaking of lights, prepare yourself to dive into the mind of Plato, as I will be using the famous Allegory of the Cave to illustrate the perennial relevance of the concept that is enlightenment. So, to begin, let's think about the historical context in which we currently live in. You are, of course, a historical being the same way you are a biological one. Many inventions of the past are so deeply integrated into our society that we take them almost completely for granted, and this is actually due to the nature of your physiological and neural machinery. We take our complex language, ability to read, write, and create art as a natural human phenomenon. We think of ourselves as a creature governed by the interplay between our capacities for rationality and emotion. We see ourselves as autonomous individuals with a capacity for critical thinking. But could it always have been this way? Well, certainly not, and most people who are not either interested in the history of philosophy or the history of science will never really be forced to contemplate the history of the psychotechnologies that are afforded to us through the evolution of human culture. You see, the psychological technologies that I am referring to are things such as language, literacy, numeracy, metaphor, mindfulness, and spiritual practices such as prayer. And so the easiest way to understand what I mean by using that term psychotechnology is just to think about your relationship to what we call technology in the physical world. So, today I was actually talking with a friend about these things, and I was telling him about how I was going to go and shoot this podcast, and I used this example. I said, well, if you see what a cup is, I know that a cup is a simple type of technology. It's nothing like the computer that sits before me, but you take a cup and you really think about what a cup does. What is its purpose? How is it beneficial or useful to the human organism? Well, it's basically like there is a water source of some sort, and you want to take your water with you somewhere else so that you don't have to stay at the source. And so at some point, human beings invented, and we have a name for it now, a cup. It's really that simple. But what a cup does is that it manipulates the physical world to some degree, and we have this thing, this item, that has a purpose and a function. So it has a structure and it has a function. So technology is the human's way of manipulating the environment so that we may take advantage of the structure and the function of things that we invent. That's just about all I have to say about what technology is from a little bit more of a technical definition, right? And so then when you think about what a psychotechnology is, it's that same process but at the psychic level. And so I went on a whole spiel to my friend about how we have a working memory. So one thing that we know quite well in psychology is that the average human mind has a working memory that can hold about 6 or 7 separate items in it at once. But the example that I want to use to kind of elucidate this point of what a working memory is imagine I told you to keep a person's address in mind while being given directions. Or, for example, remembering a phone number while someone is making noise in the corner, or maybe remembering a shopping list while talking to a friend. So having to juggle multiple things in one's mind at once in the present moment is what we refer to as working memory. Now we know that human beings have a limited working memory, so it is very useful that we have something like books, for example, which allows us to put things that we're working out in our working memory as we're thinking and being creative with our language. And then we write that on paper, which was at some point, this is a technology and a psychotechnology that evolved in human culture. I mean, it had to have at some point, right? There was a time before books, and then there was a time where books were being written. And of course, you have to line it up in your timeline of thinking about when was language developed? When were symbols developed? When was, we as a society use an alphabetic type of language, and it always hasn't been that way, right? When we look back to the past at ancient hieroglyphs and things like that, these things evolve. The same way our technology evolves, our psychotechnologies evolve. So I want to say all of that to put a little bit of a spotlight on how influential Plato is as a thinker in our culture, right? And I'm not talking about just for the Western person, because Plato is available to all, right? And a lot of Plato's thinking is quite universal. And for example, the story of the cave, which is what we're going to be getting into here today, is a perennial myth. And I don't mean to use myth in the same way that we bust a myth, right? Like something that is silly that people believe and it's like, oh, that's just a myth, bro. No. What I mean by myth is a perennial story that holds true and has universal properties. So this allegory, which could be thought of as an analogy, is a myth in a sense, and we'll get into that more later. Okay, so Plato is often credited to being one of the first people to unify many different psychotechnologies into a systematic approach to thinking and living, which we might call philosophy. Now, ancient Greek philosophy is extremely influential and was pivotal for philosophy, and according to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Plato was, quote, not the first thinker or writer to whom the word philosopher should be applied, but he was so self-conscious about how philosophy should be conceived and what its scope and ambitions properly are, and he so transformed the intellectual currents with which he grappled, that the subject of philosophy, as it is often conceived, which is a rigorous and systematic examination of ethical, political, metaphysical, and epistemological issues armed with a distinctive method, can be called his invention. Few other authors in the history of Western philosophy approximate him in depth and range. Perhaps only Aristotle, who studied with Plato, Thomas Aquinas, and Immanuel Kant would be generally agreed to be of the same rank, unquote. So what I just read to you comes directly from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. If you are interested in the trilogy of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, I recommend doing some reading using the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy for yourself, as many entries revolve around these brilliant Greek thinkers amongst all thinkers that make up the body of work that is philosophy. Now, as I've already said, today I'm going to read aloud one of Plato's most influential and famous stories, which is called the Allegory of the Cave. This will serve as an introduction to Plato, as well as a really eye-opening analogy that is critical of the human experience even as we live today, over 2,000 years after Plato conceived the story originally. Now, it is important to note that Plato often utilized dialogue and story to make his philosophical points more intelligible and relatable, which makes this story even more profound. So, here is a word-for-word reading of Plato's famous Allegory of the Cave. Okay, so the version of the story that I found is on scholar.harvard.edu. It says, Plato, the Allegory of the Cave, translated by Sean Iyer. It begins with this kind of introduction. Plato's famous Allegory of the Cave, written around 380 BCE, is one of the most important and influential passages of The Republic, which is a book by Plato. It vividly illustrates the concept of idealism as it was taught in the Platonic Academy, and provides a metaphor which philosophers have used for millennia to help us overcome superficiality and materialism. In this dialogue, Socrates, who is the main speaker, explains to Plato's brother, Glaucon, that we all resemble captives who are chained deep within a cavern, who do not yet realize that there is more to reality than the shadows they see against the wall. Okay, so I'm going to proceed to read the dialogue between Socrates, who is the main speaker, Now, Socrates in this story, yes, of course, there was an actual historical Socrates, but Plato uses Socrates as a character in this story. And then the other character is Glaukon, that's spelled Glaukon. I'll slightly change the intonation of my voice so that you know who is speaking when. But Socrates is really, the majority of this dialogue is dominated by Socrates. And now allow me to draw a comparison in order to understand the effect of learning, or the lack thereof, upon our nature. Imagine that there are people living in a cave deep underground. The cavern has a mouth that opens to the light above, and a passage exists from this all the way down to the people. They have lived here from infancy, with their legs and necks bound in chains. They cannot move. All they can do is stare directly forward, as the chains stop them from turning their heads around. Imagine that far above and behind them blazes a great fire. Between this fire and the captives, a low partition is erected along a path, something like puppeteers use to conceal themselves during their shows. I can picture it. Look, and you will also see other people carrying objects back and forth along the partition, things of every kind, images of people and animals carved in stone and wood and other materials. Some of these other people speak, while others remain silent. A bizarre situation for some unusual captives. So we are. Now, tell me if you suppose it's possible that these captives ever saw anything of themselves or one another, other than the shadows flitting across the cavern wall before them. Certainly not, for they are restrained all their lives, with their heads facing forward only. And that would be just as true for the objects moving to and fro behind them? Certainly. Now, if they could speak, would you say that these captives would imagine that the names they gave to the things they were able to see applied to real things? Well, it would have to be so. And if a sound reverberated through their cavern from one of those others passing behind the partition, do you suppose that the captives would think anything but the passing shadow was what really made the sound? No, by Zeus. Then undoubtedly, such captives would consider the truth to be nothing but the shadows of the carved objects. Well, most certainly. Look again and think about what would happen if they were released from these chains and these misconceptions. Imagine if one of them was set free from his shackles and immediately made to stand up and bend his neck around, to take steps, to gaze up toward the fire, and all of this was painful, and the glare from the light made him unable to see the objects that cast the shadows he once beheld. What do you think his reaction would be if someone informed him that everything he had formerly known was illusion and delusion, but that now he was a few steps closer to reality, oriented now toward things that were more authentic and able to see more truly? And even further, if one would direct his attention to the artificial figures passing to and fro and ask him what their names are, would this man not be at a loss to do so? Would he rather believe that the shadows he formerly knew were more real than the objects now being shown to him? Much more real. Now, if he was forced to look directly at the firelight, wouldn't his eyes be pained? Wouldn't he turn away and run back to those things which he normally perceived and understood them as more defined and clearer than the things now being brought to his attention? That's right. Let's say that he is forcibly dragged up the steep climb out of the cavern and firmly held until finally he stands in the light of the sun. Don't you think that he would be agitated and even begin to complain? Under that light, would his eyes not be nearly blinded, unable to discern any of those things that we ourselves call real? No, he wouldn't see them at first. It would take time, I suppose, for him to get used to seeing higher things. In the beginning, he might only trace the shadows. Then, reflections of people and other things in the water. Next, he would come to see the things themselves. Then he would behold the heavenly bodies and the heaven itself by night, seeing the light of the stars and the moon with greater ease than the sun in its light by day. Indeed so. And then I think he would at last be able to gaze upon the sun itself, neither as reflected in water, nor as a phantom image in some other place, but in its own place as it really is. Undeniably. And now he will begin to reason. He will find that the sun is the source for the seasons and the years and governor of every visible thing, and is ultimately the origin of everything previously known. Of course, first he would see, and then he would start to draw conclusions. That being the case, should he remember his fellow prisoners and their original dwelling, and what was accepted as wisdom in that setting? Don't you imagine he would consider himself fortunate for this transformation and feel pity for the captives? I agree. Now, suppose there were honors and awards among the captives, which they granted as prizes to one another for being the best at recognizing the various shadows passing by or deciphering their patterns, their order, and the relationships among them, and therefore best at predicting what shadow would be seen next. Do you believe that our liberated man would be much concerned with such honors, or that he would be jealous of those who received them, or that he would strive to be like those who were lauded by the captives and enjoyed pride of place among them? Or would rather he take Homer's view, and rather wish in earthly life to be the humble serf of a landless man, and suffer whatever he had to, instead of holding the views of the captives and returning to that state of being? Truly, he would rather suffer a great deal than return to such a life. Well, here's something else to consider. If such a man would suddenly go from the sunlight to once more descend to his original circumstances, wouldn't his vision be obscured by the darkness? Yes, it obviously would. And so let's say he is with the captives and gets put into the position of interpreting the wall shadows. His eyes are still adjusting to the darkness, and it may take a while before they are. Wouldn't he become a laughingstock? Wouldn't they say, "You have returned from your adventure up there with ruined eyes"? Would they not say that the ascent was a waste of time? And if they had the opportunity, do you suppose that they might raise their hands against him and kill this person who is trying to liberate them to a higher plane? Yeah, I'm afraid so. Then, my friend Glaucon, this image applies to everything we've been discussing. It compares the visible world to the underground cavern, and the power of the sun to the fire that burned in the cavern. You won't misunderstand me if you connect the captive's ascent to be the ascent of the soul to the intelligible world. This is how I believe, and I shared it at your wish, though heaven knows whether it is all true. Regardless, it appears to me that in the realm of what can be known, the idea of the good is discovered last of all, and it is only perceived with great difficulty. But when it is seen, it leads us directly to the finding that is the universal cause of all that is right and beautiful. It is the source of visible light and the master of the same, and in the intelligible world, it is the master of truth and reason, and whoever in private or in public would behave in a sensible way will keep this idea in focus. I agree to the extent I can manage to understand, Socrates. Stay with me then for another thought. We should not be surprised that individuals who have reached this level might be unwilling to spend their time on mundane affairs, for would it not be that their souls always feel a calling to the higher things? If our illustration holds true, that would seem quite likely. Yes, likely indeed, I suppose. Now, would it be at all surprising for one who has been engaged in the contemplation of holy things when he ventures into ways of degenerate humanity to appear ridiculous in his actions? What if, for example, While his eyes were still adjusting to the mundane gloom, he would be forced to appear in court to hold forth about the mere shadows of justice or the other shapes that flitted across the wall, and to engage in debate about such concepts with the minds of others who have never beheld the ideal justice. It would not surprise me the least. But one who has his wits about him would remember that there are two things that pain the eyes: being brought from darkness to light, and transitioning back from light to darkness. Now, considering that the soul experiences the same discomfort, this man would not make light of another when he met with a confused soul. He would take the time to understand if that soul was coming from a luminous realm and his eyes were blinded by darkness, or whether journeying from the darkness of ignorance into an illuminated state had overwhelmed his eyes. One he would consider fortunate. He would pity the other, and if he laughed at either, it would be less justified if he laughed at the expense of the one who was descending from the light above. Yes, that's a fitting way to put it, Socrates. Of course, if I'm correct, then some of our educators are mistaken in their view that it is possible to implant knowledge into a person that wasn't there originally, like vision into the eyes of a blind man. Yeah, that's what they say, Socrates. What our message now signifies is that the ability and means of learning is already present in the soul, as the eye could not turn from darkness to light unless the whole body moved. So it is that the mind can only turn around from the world of becoming to that of being by a movement of the whole soul. The soul must learn by degrees to endure the contemplation of being in the luminous realms. This is the good. Agreed? I agree. Therefore, of this matter itself, there must be a craft of some kind which would be a most efficient and effective means of transforming the soul. It would not be an art that gives the soul vision, but a craft at labor, under the assumption that the soul has its own innate vision, but does not apply it properly. There must be some kinds of means for bringing this about, don't you suppose, Glaucon? Yes, Socrates. Such craft must exist. Okay, so there's the Allegory, which comes from Plato's Republic. This book is a Socratic dialogue, where he employs Socratic methods and even uses Socrates as a character within the dialogue to illustrate his points, as you just saw. This book is Plato's most recognizable work. Now, what a story, right? I see this episode as a possible nudge that you may have needed to break free from the chains that keep you entertained by illusions, gripped by shiny things, and awarded for your willful ignorance. Just like the people who refuse to be freed from the cave, we humans like to excel in the worlds we know. It is much easier and convenient to stay a big fish in a small pond. It is much easier to learn how to navigate the world that we have always been given, and it is extremely difficult to explore the possibility that we have all been living in a delusion. You see, this analogy as I see it does not necessarily discriminate. It's more like a tool. It's a psychotechnology. This analogy holds both the atheist and the God-fearing person to the same standard. It urges you to question the sources that provide you information. It forces you to be extremely critical of your own relationship to your perceptions, and it asks of you to deal with the uncomfortable transformation of, quote, adjusting to the light, unquote. It asks of you to abandon the status games that you are embedded within if those games are dominated by superficiality and materialism. So my question for you is this: how close do you wish to come into contact with truth? Or do you prefer the bliss of ignorance, the convenience of assumption, the satisfaction of confirming your own bias and using egocentric explanations for your purposes? What do you fear more? That you'll never take the risk of glimpsing the light, thus becoming transformed, just like Socrates, and maybe even perceived as dangerous or mad, but with the possibility of cultivating a more meaningful life where that which deserves priority will receive priority. But I will warn that although we can ponder the existence of the sun once we get above ground, we are perennially uninformed about the nature of our world. It really is just a matter of how close to the light you are willing to get before its heat source is unbearable and actually starts to become destructive. But do you fear the light? Do you love your chains? And will you continue to turn a blind eye? Me personally, I fear not being perceived as strange. I fear not being subject to anyone's tyranny, right? That's what the shackles represent. We are being imprisoned, not necessarily by a person or a persons, although that is often also the case, but in a sense, our psyche is given this circumstance where we take what we see at face value. And what Plato provides with the allegory of the cave is this systematic way of coming to terms with how ignorant you are about reality. That is the whole Socratic project. That is the Platonic project. It's to be so self-critical, so almost skeptical in a sense, right? And there's other great philosophers like the ones mentioned, Aquinas and Kant, and Descartes comes to mind as these people who are extremely critical of the world around them. And it's not necessarily because they think they know it all, right? That's one of the traps. Is it sometimes can be provocative when somebody comes around and is spewing things like this kind of story and they have this knowledge. I mean, I've experienced this firsthand, to be honest, and that is why I like this story, because it's a bit of a support for me, because I understand that the human mind is in a default way shackled, right? And what we perceive immediately without effort is what's right in front of us. And then we see and we're embedded into a culture, and it's not because this culture or this culture is particularly malevolent and pathological. It seems more as if no matter what culture you're brought up into, you take the superficial qualities of that culture and you embed them within your worldview. And then you try to climb the ladder of that status game. Because, of course, as human beings, we are a social primate who values status. That's not something that's really up for debate. Fundamentally, we are interested in status. We are interested in rising in status. Now, that isn't actually probably going to be the topic of my next episode, because it closely relates to what exactly was going on when the liberated man, the man who was freed from his shackles, left the cave and he glimpsed the light and he saw reality and he went back into the cave. And then he was made a laughingstock, as Plato put it. He was even possibly harmed physically and was violently abused for his deranged delusions about reality and trying to liberate these people. Well, what happens is that we challenge the status quo when we do things like what this character, the liberated man, does within the allegory of the cave. And we already know with modern neuroscience and psychology that new things, the default way that most people are going to perceive new things, foreign things, strange things, is through negative emotion. Because you have to imagine, it is dangerous to allow new things into a system that's working. So if all you have ever known is this tyranny and you're allowed to perceive the shadows, so to speak, on the wall of the cave, if that's all you ever know, and you know that the only way to be rewarded and to gain status amongst this game, which is to, recognize the patterns of the shadows, which on a little bit more of a complex note that I'll touch on real quick is it's kind of like using correlational patterns as a way to confirm your own bias about the world, right? So like I'm in a psych statistics class right now, and the number one principle in statistics is that correlation does not equal causation. So there's patterns in our environment, right? There's patterns in our environment. But oftentimes as human beings, because of our condition, this is what I mean by we're shackled. We're shackled to that cave wall. Default mode. That's our default mode. is to perceive things the way they are, the way they appear to us, and we're not very critical of them. It's the same way that if you say, for example, somebody gives you kind of a ridiculous correlation. For example, a famous relationship, this is actually going to be a negative correlation that is used to illustrate this point, that correlation does not equal causation. There is actually an inverse relationship between the number of pirates, like pirates that legitimately were on big ships and cannons and stuff like that, and global temperature. But once again, correlation does not necessarily mean causation. In the graph, the average global temperature increased at the same time as the number of pirates and pirating, like the way that we think about pirates, like on a ship out on the seas, decreased. So there's a correlation between those things, but there's not causation. But what those people in the caves are doing, in a sense, and what the whole process of science, the whole discipline of science, is to try to understand and to uncover and to expose and to come into closer contact with the actual causal patterns in reality. And that is why Plato and Socrates are so influential, because they are so critical of the world around us. They don't take things at face value. Now, of course, they didn't have all the answers. These are men. These are men, after all. These are limited human beings with a limited working memory and things like that, but they're also extremely brilliant, and we could learn so much by looking at the past. And so really, to finish out this episode, I genuinely don't want you to use this allegory and this analogy to demonize some position, whether it's a political or a philosophical position or a religious position, to demonize the other. Because the point isn't to say, oh, yeah, me as somebody who is a right-wing conservative, yeah, I could see the light, and the lefties are in the dark, or vice versa. I'm a progressive liberal, and I'm extremely open-minded and psychologically liberal and want to, the evil conservatives just can't even comprehend the light, so to speak, right? Their status game is so ignorant and silly. The point isn't to demonize another particular ideology or a position that challenges your own. It is to challenge your position as that which is in the cave, and to liberate yourself from strict absolutes, speaking in absolutes and saying this is the only way, and to liberate yourself and to rise up. And, Plato's whole philosophy surrounded this idea that there's the kind of normal world, which is this world of superficiality that we can see, the day-to-day world, and then there's a higher world, which is made of concepts and forms and ideas and things like that. And so I could talk a little bit more about Plato probably in another time. I highly recommend that you deep dive into Plato, because Platonism and Neoplatonism are extremely useful philosophies for a wide depth and range of things in your life. And really, use this allegory and think to yourself, would I rather be willfully ignorant of the truth, right? We're using light as a metaphor for truth, for reality. The sun is, of course, the powerful source of light. The flame is just a little microcosm of the light that's casting these shadows in which these people who are in the cave are perceiving the shadows, and they create these games, these status games about who can, predict the next pattern, who's good at this particular game. But you realize that if you are somebody that gets above ground here, you almost feel pity for those people who are stuck in superficiality and materialism and are so stuck in their ways of thinking that they would not allow themselves to be liberated. So yes, use this as you will. I really appreciate you tuning in and listening to Plato's allegory of the cave and a little bit of my own philosophical discourse on the topic and what it all means. So thank you. And may you never let that flame die, right? Because it will always be there. It's just a matter of closing yourself off from it and having to go through the pain that comes with adjusting to its brightness. Thank you for listening to this installment of Text Appeal, lessons on the body, mind, and beyond.